Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Church Leadership Podcast. We're so glad you're here. Welcome back if you are one of the faithful listeners or watchers on YouTube. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, we're glad you're on board. And we want to encourage all of you to go subscribe to the podcast. You can do that on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button, click on the thumbs up, and you'll be notified every time a new video is posted. And if you're listening, we're now on Amazon Music, as well as Spotify and Apple and every other avenues. So make sure you subscribe. We don't want you to miss a single episode. You know, our mission every single episode is to encourage and equip you to lead in the local church. And we definitely believe today's conversation is going to do that.
Absolutely. We are glad to have a return guest with us. Todd Adkins is joining us on the podcast this week. And you may remember Todd from a previous episode of the Church Leadership Podcast. Todd serves as the Director of Leadership at LifeWay, and he is also a podcaster. He hosts 5 Leadership Questions, and he also co-hosts the New Churches podcast with Ed Stezer and Daniel M., who has been on the podcast before. Todd, we are so glad you've taken time out of your schedule to join us today. We appreciate it.
Hey, I'm glad, man. I had to look down as the camera came on because I was like, okay, what shirt am I wearing? What do I have on? A pipeline shirt? I'm always like, I always have a swag on because my wife jokes that it's my uniform, especially now during COVID. But I got a great story. When I was an intern back in the day, I can remember helping, part of what I did was pastoral research, which basically meant sometimes reading business books and relating them to the church, which was great for me. It really helped form and shape me. And I won't out the guy that I'm telling about, but man, this is a great story. So he's going to the Baptist State Convention later that day. And he asked me how he looks. And I'm like, I laughed and made some kind of comment. And he just thought that I was joking or whatever. But he was wearing nice pants, a sport coat, and he had a t-shirt on underneath his sport coat, which looked pretty good. The only problem was it said Guinness, and he had no idea what Guinness was. And he was speaking at said Baptist State Convention that night. He leaves and shows up, and luckily someone pulls him aside, and it was like his father-in-law, like he had gotten a bunch of clothes from his father-in-law. Because we all know, we've been there earlier in our pastor careers where sometimes we receive those types of gifts. And he had no idea that he was about to go to speak to all these pastors with a Guinness shirt.
Hilarious.
I'm just guessing here. I'm just throwing this out. Were they pleated pants?
I don't know. It was late 90s.
I can just picture it. I can just picture
late 90s.
Pleated pants and a Guinness t-shirt with a blazer. I can just picture it.
Hey, I mean, if it was a Methodist State Convention or maybe, Presbyterian or Catholic, I mean, he'd be fine.
He
Baptist,
would.
I'm not so sure.
Yeah, not so sure. But yeah.
Had nothing to do with world records, that t-shirt.
I basically roll with some form of pipeline or grid t-shirt almost every day, just because.
Smart choice.
We buy quality swag so that we can wear it all the time.
There you go. That's it. Represent.
Hey, that's our motto. Anytime we give away stuff on our podcast, if it's not something we wouldn't use or don't use, we're not going to give it away.
So, right.
What's the point?
Yeah,
What is the point?
Right. Well, speaking of stories, okay.
All right.
Before we get into the meat of everything, now, I mean, I've seen you in a lot of different contexts in a lot of different places. This may be the first time I've ever seen you with just a masonite brick background. Yeah. So those listening, you've got just a masonite brick background. Where are you?
I'm in the newcomers room at my church because
the sign
going on in my house. today. And I was like, I just wrapped up did a podcast with John Mark Comer, and like we had an incident, I think the last time we had done a podcast with him where something happened technology wise, and I'm like, I'm not going to let that happen again. I'm going to make sure that this is done well. It's only 10 minutes down the road, so I came to my church to do this today, and so that's the reason why.
Your
That
church,
makes sense.
yeah, your
That makes
church you're at has a interesting story you were telling us, and I think it would be
Okay.
Yeah,
why
I mean,
you're
now,
at
it's
the
how I
church
met the-
Adkins,
you were
Todd
at.
Adkins at a church has got to be a little intimidating.
Yeah,
Well, I did. So I told these guys, I've been at LifeWay for almost 9 years, and this is either my 6th or 7th church. Because my background, I was an executive pastor at McLean Bible, where Platt is now. And, my job was strategic initiatives and staff development. But really, I always cared. Strategic initiatives meant launch 9 campuses in 4.5 years. And I was obsessed with environment. I'm obsessed with sound quality. I'm obsessed with everything. So the first Sunday that we are here, not at this church, but a church in Nashville, very first Sunday, it was People's Church at the time. Now it's Darren Whitehead's there, and it's Church of the City. But we go in, and I walk back to the soundboard, and my wife is like, you cannot do that. This is not your church. Everyone is going to hate us everywhere we go. Fast forward probably 3 or 4 years later, and we're trying out a new church, 2 or 3 churches in. And it's not that I don't play well, I need to play ball, or I don't I just need to do something. If you give me something constructive to do, I promise I would be an asset to your church. So we're at this new church. We're about to try out this new church. It's 2 weeks to Easter. They've got their big Easter banner out front, the welcome, Easter is going to be happening in a couple weeks. Well, the sign had come undone, and it was a big banner sign. So it's like, laying in the grass. So I drive by that, and my wife is like, and I make a comment. She's, don't you dare do it. We drive a little bit further, and I'm not going to mention the church, but we drive a little bit further, and the guest parking sign is a sandwich board, but it's in the ditch. So I go in, I have 4 children, get them all out, and we're checking in, and I tell a volunteer what I have seen. Like, hey, you may want to say something to somebody about whatever. So check in, we take our kids to class, and I, look out the door to see if anything has been done in true fashion. Nothing's been done. So we then go, and my wife, again, don't do it. We go to church, and then she wants to check out a Sunday school class. We know some of the people there that are teaching a Sunday school class. One of them was, the person in question was the then associate vice president of LifeWay, Brad Wagner. And we were going to check out his Sunday school class. He was my mentor at seminary, part the way I turned out, for good or for better or for worse. And so we then we're after service. I look, still hasn't been fixed, and she's like, "Okay, you can go." So I go and fix it. Come back to the Sunday school class. Well, the next day, one of the vice presidents at LifeWay, who ran a division of LifeWay at the time, was like, "What was Todd Adkins doing at my church yesterday, fixing a sign? Like, he doesn't even go there. What was going on?" And so then Brad says, because he's an XP, and that's what XPs do. And, how many people drove by that sign, and all this whole thing. Well, it got back to the staff. So I then had to go back to the staff with hat in hand and say, hey, I'm so sorry. I really want to help. I really want to be an asset. What can I do? And so I served in preschool there for a year and a half, almost 2 years, in order to do my penance.
I was about to say,
I thought you were about to
We'll
say
show
purgatory.
you.
Look, 6 months later, though, I was doing pipeline with these people. It turned out to be great. And I met a person who's now, if not my best friend, one of my best friends, who's the senior pastor here at this church, Mark Satterfield. And he was the XP there. And, We met. So of course, in true fashion, I'm texting him about 30 minutes before saying, hey, I really need a place to do a podcast. So
Yeah, it's
actually,
a
what's
happy
really
ending. It lets
funny
you
is
use their storage room now.
Yeah.
what's really funny is I texted him and Brad Wagner's son, Brant Wagner, who's at Fellowship, and I'm like, which one of you wants me?
Need a spot.
Need a spot.
Yeah, I think everybody who's listening to this podcast right now completely relates to the end of your story. Only a few are going to relate to the front part of the story. So most people probably are going to drive by the signs and not think twice about it. So
Yep.
that's the way God's geared you and wired you and everything. But what you're talking about, everybody's dealing with the same kind of stuff. We're having to work from home. We're having to work from the office. We're having to be flexible. And that's kind of what we wanted to really talk about for a few minutes, is kind of where we are right now, what you're seeing. And I mean, you're talking about the fact that you've been talking about the fact that there's a lot of fear in ministry right now for the way things are, and maybe how some people are dealing with that in healthy and unhealthy ways. What did you want to talk about as far as what some pastors are experiencing now that we're kind of a little further down the road? We're not out of the woods yet, but we're a little further down the road than where we were a year ago entering into all this.
I think the biggest issues that are happening right now, I mean, we have the luxury of talking to pastors every single day and doing, calls where we're trying to either process a specific issue or just delve into some church health overall. But most of the time, what I'm talking to somebody about is either a significant change. And usually that means we're looking at, strategies and structures and processes within their church. And we're really trying to give them, hey, here's, if we go through these 8 steps together with as a staff, then we're going to come out with your own thing. I'm not trying to shove any expert knowledge or anything like that. I'm not trying to tell you what to do or what to think. I'm actually helping you to figure out how to think for your local context. There is no one that is more equipped and gifted and honestly in the right position to be able to lead your church through whatever change you need to do other than you. And so taking something off the shelf from somebody else is not in your best interest. You've got to ferret that out and lead it with your people. So all that to say, that's a long way of setting up that answer to say, what I'm seeing is people are buying into a complete pendulum shift in that they're hearing everything has changed, everything is pivoting, you have to move or you're going to be left behind. And so I think that is a emotional reaction versus a thoughtful response. So I feel like most of us, and I think I said it last time we were on, I talked about intuitive leadership versus intentional leadership, that most of us are in place because we're good intuitive leaders. And we won't reach a new gear. We won't find that new gear that we're looking for ourselves, our staff, or our church until we look at it in an intentional view. And the way that I'm looking at that right now is, am I reacting intuitively or am I responding intentionally? And so I think that it's really weighing and measuring, okay, what does need to change? What does need to shift? What needs to stay the same? What is not changing? And what is something that we may want to consider changing at least for a time or testing out for a time. But yeah, I mean, that is the biggest shift. I think people are, they're making shifts before they really know what the reason why they're making the shift is because they think everybody's doing it or it's a response to fear. Mm-hmm. It's not based on data. It's based on 2 or 3 things they heard either from their own people or from a podcast or somebody's blog or whatever. When I would say, hey, you really need to take a step back and think about this a lot before you make this shift, because when you make this shift, you're going to shift your culture.
That's right.
That's so true. That's so powerful. And I think I think things are so fast and furious, at least they have been the last several months, that it's easy to react. It's easy to give into that fear and think you're making thoughtful choices when really you're 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 giving into that emotion. That's good, man. That's powerful. Well, so I mean, we're recording this in February of 2021, and Andy mentioned we're not done with COVID.
Right.
I do think we're in another. It seems like that we're in another season or another phase of it, at least with the vaccines starting, and getting more availability for that. And so I think the fear level of our people has changed a little bit, and so I think, at least in my observation, churches are operating a little bit differently than they have been the last several months. What are some positive trends that you have seen churches begin to make, some positive shifts that you have seen that really are thoughtful responses rather than reactive change?
I would say what's interesting is from the outside, it would be difficult to see some of this stuff. But when you're exposed to as many churches who are saying the same thing, but doing them differently, you begin to see it. And that is, there are churches that have been measuring engagement and calling it discipleship for years and years and years. And there's a difference between engagement and discipleship. So church growth movement, we all have experienced what that has been. And, we know the strengths and weaknesses and all of that. I'm not here to call out anybody or anything, because I was a part of all those and lifted those up and still do lift up part of it. But here's the thing. We measured what was easy to measure and called it important and called it a discipleship. When now what you're seeing is I heard tons of people when this first started say, oh, we're going to take our people deeper. We're going to take our people deeper. We're going to go deeper into discipleship during this time. We are not going to waste this time that God has given us. We're going to go deeper into discipleship. And I would love to go back and review, like, how amazing would it be to have everybody do transformational discipleship and then that assessment, and then look at before and after, because I think people will be shocked at the results, and I don't think it would be good results. But I have seen churches, some churches strip down what they do and really focus on, what those most important elements are. And I think they're going to be the ones that come out the most successful. Malphurs and Mancini wrote Building Leaders. And this book is like 20 years old. But there was an analogy in there about a ship. And of course, I took that analogy and put it into a quadrant.
Of course.
But it's really about, if you think about who's on board with your vision and who's contributing, not necessarily contributing to the vision, but who's making contributions, not financial contributions necessarily, contributions through, they're using their gifts and services to Christ, leadership, whatever. So in that framework, when you put it in a quadrant, what the beautiful thing that happens is you see stowaways, you see passengers, you see pirates, and you see people that are crew. They're really in there. What crew means is they are both really on board with your vision, and they're contributing in alignment with that vision. So there are tons and tons of people in our churches that we would put in the crew category because they were showing up, or because they were showing up to a couple of different things. We were measuring engagement and calling them crew or calling them disciples, when the reality is they were just stowaways or passengers. Even if they were somewhat on board with our vision, if they're not actively contributing toward that vision, then they're just a passenger. Just showing up is not crew. Right. And so I truly believe that when this is over, we're going to be missing a lot of our stowaways and passengers. Meanwhile, you have this whole other group down here to deal with, which is your pirates, because anybody who is contributing in a direction that is not in alignment with the vision and values, especially if you've realigned or recast what the strategy is during this time, it is an act of piracy, insubordination. It's a mutiny. I'm telling you, anything that is not in alignment with that strategy that you've set during this time for your church to use its gifts in service to Christ to feed the body and each other and make your impact in your local community. There's no other thing that's more sacred or strategic than the local church. And right now, I feel like a lot of us have just been in neutral and we gave up. We didn't look for innovative ways to leverage some of our existing things that we did in order to, make it viable during the pandemic. What we did was we tried to neutralize the effect. So we just shifted our services to online, and that was it. We settled for that neutral thing. So it may sound like, I know I've talked for way too much. I've broken one of my cardinal rules, which is a guest that speaks more than 3 minutes at a time, I got to reel them in. I got to interrupt them and bring them back in because nobody wants to hear them. I know I sound like I have gone off on, and I'm one of those people on the far side of the pendulum. And I would say, no, I'm saying that don't throw everything out. Don't be so, don't toss out what is truly creative and innovative and intentional for your community and settle for the illusion of somebody else's creative, intentional thing for their community. Don't look at what Craig Groeschel is doing. Don't look at what fill in the box is doing or what this expert says or whatever. Ferret it out for yourself prayerfully and thoughtfully and intentionally with your church and your body that God has given you to steward in mind. Every gift, every asset that you have, and look at it from a stewardship perspective and leverage it.
That is so good. And the reason we don't is, let's just be real. That's hard. It takes work, hard, but we've got to do it.
Yeah.
It's hard emotionally.
Yep. Well, this has been a really tough season for people leading in any organization, especially in the church. And what you've been talking about, I mean, the reality is most pastors and church leaders right now have hurt feelings. They're discouraged, they're angry, they're upset, they're confused. And some of that is over the loss of so many people. And reality is a lot of people are not attending our in-person services right now because of fear, because of the fact that this virus is real, and they may be at a place where they're susceptible or they're compromised or they're around people who are, and we understand that. And we want to be able to compassionately shepherd them. But then there are those people who have been the stowaways and the passengers who aren't coming back. They haven't come back yet. And I predict a lot of them won't be coming back. And how would you speak to pastors and church leaders right now to kind of encourage them instead of being fearful that maybe they're out, going to another church or watching other services or whatever? Instead of that fear, how would you encourage them to say, you know what, stay the course, keep trying to, like you said, be intentional and innovative while staying on mission? I mean, the culture of our churches have changed so much. How would you encourage pastors and church leaders right now who have that fear that, well, it's been a year now and some of these people are not back yet?
I think all of us are going to be susceptible to a fear of loss, but it's different for different people. So for some, it may be loss of identity as a pastor, and even some people in our congregation, it may be a loss of their own personal identity because they may have been crew, but because of the way that COVID has taken place and its effect that it has on our churches, they've been relegated to passenger, whether they wanted to or not. And you better have a strategy to go back after those people and get them back into that category of crew. And that's not just because we want, that number. It's because that's a real person that we're called to shepherd and steward, and it's a responsibility that we have. Okay, sorry. There's also the fear of so loss of identity. I think there's also the fear of loss of knowledge. Like, I'm supposed to know what to do. This is not what I signed up for. This is not what I signed up for, God. This is not what I signed up for, church. And I don't know what to do. It's the fear of knowledge, of knowing what to do. It's the fear of the loss of comfort in let's be honest. I mean, even though leadership is hard and sometimes involves hard decisions and all that, there were some of us that were pretty comfortable with where we were as well. And that's a massive loss too. I think what we have to do is, and of course, the fear that we mentioned before of it's it's the loss of the person. I feel like, they're stepping out on me with another church.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like during this, like, I don't know what these people are watching or what they're doing. They're probably, watching some other church right now, or maybe they're engaged and they're gone and they're never coming back.
Their service is better than ours online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And start checking their text messages and all that.
And the narrative that, that you are hearing, oh, it's all changed. It's completely shifted. It's asynchronous church, or, hey, everybody's just going to be watching these national, people versus their local person, these celebrity pastors and stuff like that. I think that you cannot give into that. You just have to be really, really intentional with the people that God's given you, and maybe even use that framework that we just talked about as a strategy to walk through with your leaders to say, okay, pre-COVID, how many people would we say were stowaways, passengers, crew, and pirates in our church? How many would we say now? Okay, let's have a strategic plan to go after these groups of people and move them, into this category. I think that would be an incredibly helpful exercise for you to do. I mean, by doing it as a church, and if you're lucky enough to have, multiple either leaders or even staff, then great. Do it by individual ministry area as well, and really say, okay, how can we make sure that we're not losing anybody in this whole process, and to make sure that anything that we do is at least put through some type of thought process or framework. That's about going after people. If you want a thoughtful process to go to evaluate your ministry on, just look at the original purpose of the church as one part of that quadrant, and then look at its effectiveness during COVID, and then say, okay, do we really need to change this? If it's been effective and it's been aligned with our purpose, which is making disciples who make disciples, let's be honest, or 5 purposes of the church, whatever you want to use, just say, hey, not perceived effectiveness, not sacred cowness, but effectiveness. If you have those 2 frameworks, I think that's a great place for you to just find clarity and then have a conversation. It's pointless just to get emotional about something and start to make decisions when you could really step back and say, okay, I know that I don't want to put my ministry in a box or people in boxes. But honestly, it's helpful to put them in a box, just not leave them there. What am I going to do with it once I get it in this box? That's a beautiful thing.
That's good, man. That is so solid. And I think the encouragement I've heard some specifics, but the overall encouragement I think that maybe this whole conversation has expressed, and there's a theme running here, I believe, is that, it's time to do something. Especially if you feel like you've been stuck in neutral. Well, look, COVID didn't put you in neutral. That was a choice. And it's time. It's time to begin something, whether it's to regather those people, whether it's to evaluate and to do that analysis, and then to try to recapture, whatever it is, it's time to do something. And so thank you so much, Todd. We're always encouraged when we get to hang out with you, and God uses you in our lives, not to mention in the lives of those listening and watching on the podcast. So thank you again so much, Todd, for hanging out a little bit today.
Absolutely. I'm just lucky enough that I get to talk to pastors all the time and then come talk about it. So I learned something from every staff that I'm with, whether it's a new idea that, even if they just ask a question that is just a different perspective, and something usually comes out of almost every time we're together with the pastor. So greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to the invitation to come help you dig a ditch and lay cable. So,
That's right.
All right.
yeah. So
Let us know. No. We'll send some of our best people.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll bring a backhoe.
That's right. That's right.
But Todd, thank you. Thank you so much for
Absolutely.
joining us on the podcast this week. We know this is a tough season for people to be serving in the local church. And we know people who serve in organizations and ministries like you who deal with leaders on a regular basis. You guys are under a lot of strain and stress as well. And you're committed not only to working with leaders in the local church, but I mean, what we've talked about at the beginning, we know it's funny, but you're committed to serving in the local church as well. So you're not just removed from all of this craziness. You're right in the middle of it. And we appreciate that. We appreciate your perspective and your encouragement and the wisdom that you've shared with us today.
Thank you.
Well, the rest of you, we'll see you next time.